Hello everyone. Thank you for coming this evening on a very cold and wintry day, and a special thanks to Dr. Lacalle for coming from much sunnier and warmer California. It's really the wrong time of year for her to be doing this, but thank you so much. We've got a great discussion for you tonight on neurobiology, human interconnectedness, the synergies between Catholic faith, theology and philosophy, and contemporary sciences. I'll just say a little bit to introduce things and then pass it over to our speaker. So my name's Peter. I'm the president of the Toronto chapter here of the Society of Catholic Scientists. Many of you know what that is, but for those who don't, it's an answer to the call that Pope St. John Paul II said that members of the Church who are active scientists be of service to those who are attempting to integrate the worlds of science and religion in their own intellectual and spiritual lives. And the Society does this through annual conferences, regional conferences, local chapters like this, all sorts of things. In its first 7 years, it's grown to over 2,100 members in many countries. So the United States, Canada, all around the world, and very much growing. Professors, high school students, theologians, philosophers, scientists, you name it. So I encourage you to check it out if this is the first time you've heard of it. So just a little word about the subject matter tonight. I would say it's fair to say that there is a movement afoot to abolish the possibility of human nature as we understand it, with the power of reason and will. The desire to just change it, and it's infinitely mutable. It's not new, but it's definitely becoming more prominent in today's day and age, partly driven by technology, partly driven by philosophical, cultural movements. So, on the other hand, though, personalistic philosophies such as those proposed by Karl Wojtyla, before he became Pope, and Dietrich von Hildebrand describe the human person as a whole with bodily, psychic, and spiritual dimensions tightly intertwined. And this integrative view of the person is particularly well suited to a basis for its relationality, its interaction with the world and with other persons. Where the philosophical discourse may arrive to this theoretical explanation of relationality, neuroscience illuminates with empirical data in what way bodily reality contributes to this human relationality, highlighting from a biological perspective how this basic need for connectedness is essential to health and human flourishing. And this is what our speaker proposes, that we hardwired neural mechanisms actually, and this is discernible in biological basic structure and systems of the brain that support this attachment behavior and our relationality, and it is most particularly well expressed in certain forms of relating to the world, relationships with other people, the bonds that we form. So we're very grateful to have Professor Sonsoles de Lacalle here, who obtained her MD and PhD from the University of Navarra in Spain. And in 1990, she moved to the US with a Fulbright Fellowship to train with Professor Saper in the Department of Pharmacological and Physiological Sciences at the University of Chicago. And she has taught and researched in a medical setting at the Pritzker School of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, and Ohio's University College of Medicine. She's mentored many undergraduate, graduate, and medical students, directed a training program in mental health research for undergraduates funded by the NIH, National Institutes of Health. And she's conducted numerous research enterprises and serves on several NIH study sections. And she is currently chair of the Department of Health Sciences at CSU Channel Islands. Very long list of accomplishments, but those are not all. I will stop there, though, and introduce our speaker, Sonsoles de Lacalle. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everybody, for being here. If I don't use the mic, can you hear me? Yes? If not, at the back, just wave. So, all right, so this topic has a lot of very varied connotations, and you probably will hear some suggestions of other avenues to pursue. And because I don't want to go on a limb, I wrote down my talk. I don't usually do this, but this time I figure I can't be there forever. So I'll kind of stick to my order of ideas by following my notes. So I actually have, just for fun, a cartoon. I don't know if you know Calvin and Hobbes. So this is the one I found about the brain. So this is one version of what the brain is all about, is this idea of something mysterious that people can use for zombies and other issues, right? Now, I'm not going to talk only about the brain, but the brain and the whole person, and this is very important. Humans, we are all humans, as part of the whole of material creation, we are both bodily creatures, and also we exist in space and time, living beings, and we are interdependent with other creatures in a shared environment. And at the same time, we are unique in our rational and relational capabilities that makes us different from other animals. So a recent survey of published studies using imaging techniques called functional MRI to investigate social attachments provides evidence for three main areas of the brain that are connected systems that establish, maintain, and enhance our affiliative bonds with one another. By affiliative bonds, I mean one's disposition to seek, to enjoy, and maintain close interpersonal bonds, friendship, romantic, everything. It also includes generating feelings of warmth and affection for significant others, experiencing pleasure when you hear the voice of somebody you love, of parents hearing the voice of a child, looking at pictures of loved ones. All of that is part of this affiliation. You get the idea. It's very big, and it's very human, very real. So for the biologist in the audience, these three interconnected areas are real. I promise I'm not making this up. And there is one area that we call the reward motivation system, and that includes areas of the brain with esoteric names like the ventral pallidum, the thalamus, and the striatum, and parts of the cortex. There is another area that is the social cognition or embodied simulation and empathy network, and that includes an area called the descendant amygdala, posterior cingulate cortex, inferior parietal lobe, inferior frontal gyrus, so very specific structures within the brain. And then there is a third area, or a third circuit, which can be called like the salience-related regions, and that also includes the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex. Those are the areas that provide like a context to the events that makes them jump at us. Okay, so this is just to introduce the topic and to tell you that connecting the brain with things that may appear so conceptual and abstract is a reality. One example of how that is connected is the care that all vertebrates share towards their offspring. But humans are a little bit different because we develop these affiliated bonds with non-related individuals. So animals care for the offsprings, but humans care for the offsprings, but also care for other people to which they are not necessarily related. And a lot of the data I'm going to present, I chose it specifically to relate to this kind of romantic bond, and it applies the same to the context of marriage. So let me start by something that can be very obvious, which is that our body is dimorphic. That being male or female is not something trivial about ourselves. And everything about the human person, our bodily and spiritual faculties, our affectivity, our free choices, our relationships, are all shaped by the fact that we are sexually differentiated. And being male or female is our entire identity. It's not just a way of dressing or a way of acting, it is a way of being. So at the biological level, this sexual differentiation also affects the whole of the organism, not only our procreative capacity, and that's where I'm going to go. Just to give you an example, back in 2016, the National Institute of Health, which is the largest funding agency in the US, established a policy of requiring that all the studies, all the specific experimentation be presented using both male and female animals, or humans for that matter. And the reason for this is because the difference of being male or female is present in every single one of our cells of our body, and does make a difference. Just by contrast, in the past, a lot of experimentation was done in males, and some of my colleagues will call that a patriarchal attitude, where women were considered special. Well, yeah, we like to be considered special, but it needs to be studied too, because in fact our response to, in this case, drugs, treatments, etc., is very different, and it cannot just be a smaller male body at all. In any case, the implications of this sexual difference that starts with the fact that every single cell of our body has either XX chromosome or XY, the implication for other organs, not just the reproductive organs, but every single organ, still requires a lot of medical and scientific study. But there is a lot there. For example, just to give you an example, not too long ago, there were a set of experiments done in mice, in this case, to showcase a new brain mapping technology called Q-brain. And the developers of this technology in Cold Spring Harbor discovered differences in the number of cells in the male brains versus the female brains. And they were, much to my surprise, they were surprised. And the main investigator commenting on this discovery was saying, well, we did not expect to find anything like that. The only reason we did the experiments in both male and females is because the funding agency requires that. But they found that. And then more recently, there's a group in Stanford that has used artificial intelligence to build a model that can identify 9 times out of 10 whether a male is male or female based on functionality. So these are just 2 examples, but they demonstrate that sex differences in functional brain dynamics are replicable, are generalizable, they are behaviorally relevant, of course, and they challenge the notion of a continuum in the male-female brain organization, which is an important point for other reasons. Okay, in humans, any conversation or discussion about the significance of sexual differentiation goes beyond the merely biological. And that is because, for us, sexuality does not only refer to the capacity to procreate, which is as far as the animals can go, but is actually a manifestation, I'm going to claim, of our relational nature, reaching inwards towards one's identity as human person and outwards to our interactions with each other. And this is what I would like to, if you take home a message, I'm hoping this is what you will take home with the examples I'm going to present. But before I go to the specific examples, a quick refresher on basic biology, just in case. So, humans, like other animals, I said, are sexual beings, and sexual differentiation in the brain is important because it is the substrate for behavior. So sexual differentiation starts with sexual determination, which depends on the sex of the chromosomes that the new being inherits. And that largely depends on the father, because after meiosis, all the female eggs are always going to be XX, and or actually are going to be X, and the sperm only will have either an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. So it's a matter of chance whether the offspring will be XX or XY. Now, if the embryo is XY, with the Y chromosome, it inherits a specific gene which is called the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. We are so funky with names. For short, SY. And the protein that that gene produces is the one that is going to activate a whole network of other genes and proteins that are going to develop the gonads into testes. Testes will then initiate the secretion of testosterone, which will drive the development of the male reproductive organs. If there is no Y chromosome, then there is no SRY gene, there is no SRY protein, and the gonads will develop as ovaries. Now, this does not mean that the female is the default. There is no such a thing. And the reason is that even to activate the development of the female sex organs and everything else is going to require multiple genes that need to be activated by other set of mechanisms. So this is a very complex process, and the complexity is shown, as usual, when something goes wrong. And there are some instances, rare but exist, where an XY individual may be born with a change in the gene that codes for the androgen receptor. So if that gene is inactivated or faulty, the protein does not generate, the receptor for the androgen hormone is not functional, and then the individual develops as a female. And the reason this sometimes comes to the light is because you have a girl that is not having the first period, goes to the doctor to find out what's going on, and then they find out that in fact is a male with an androgen receptor defect. So that's just one example of what can go wrong. I'm not going to get into other cases of changes because they are not relevant to my point. But in both animals and humans, maturation of the reproductive system during puberty is going to result in very high levels of gonadal hormones. And those hormones are going to sculpt the nervous system, all the brain circuits during adolescence. And adolescence is a time of pretty much a dramatic rewiring in the brain. And these hormones are essential for that to happen. So if you want, you could say that adolescence is a critical period for the final rewiring of the brain. You may or not know that actually the final rewiring happens pretty much around between age 21 to 24. So very, very late, which is when the final maturation of the frontal cortex happens with all the areas that have to do with executive function and what else. So, so what is the human meaning of this sexual differentiation? I have one other slide. So when boys or girls mature within a healthy developmental process, there is a growing harmony between the biological fact of their sex and the psychological acceptance of self as a man or a woman. And the expression of one's femininity or masculinity in relationships and in society may or may not be in accordance with the conventional expectations, depending on the degree to which expectations are just and appropriate and respectful of reality. So those personal manifestations of one's identity are very varied, cover a large gamut of possibilities, and exist as a spectrum. But the anthropological significance of our existence as male and female have everything to do with our relational social nature. And ultimately, the fact that we are relational beings is an important part of us being created in the image of God as a communion of persons. And this was highlighted by St. John Paul II when he writes that the fact that man, created as man and woman, is the image of God, means not only that each of them individually is like God, as a rational and free being, it also means that man and woman, created as a unity of the two in their common humanity, are called to live in a communion of love, and in this way to mirror in the world the communion of love that is in God through which the three persons love each other in the intimate mystery of the one divine life. I think this paragraph kind of sets the tone and provides a strong guideline for a lot of this work that can be done. So sexuality, therefore, encompasses everything that pertains to the essence of humanity, its structural composition of body, psyche, spirit, the harmonization of various faculties in action, as well as the relation of the person with others and with the world, especially through the gift of self. So as Peter already brought up earlier, the rejection of the social identity of the human being, either in theory or in practice, follows in part from the rejection of the vulnerability that it implies. In fact, vulnerability which is not just potential, but actual woundedness, as history painfully shows. And both men and women have suffered from very unjust constraints in their personal behavior, in their service to the common good, based on erroneous conventions about what femininity or masculinity may mean. And instead of the relationships between men and women characterized by a harmonious mutual self-giving, it is instead has been dominated by injustice, using each other and treating each other as competitors or slaves. So I'm not going to address the emergence or the root causes of gender ideology, which is where this could be going into, but it is important to bring up that attacks to masculinity results in attacks to femininity, because masculinity and femininity are interdependent concepts. What do I mean by this? Well, that one is male in relation to a female, and vice versa. I mean, it's pretty clear that masculinity and femininity do not have the same meaning today that they had 20 years ago. It is also clear that they are presented in very different ways in different societies. Nonetheless, femininity and masculinity are not completely malleable realities. They are not something at the service of the person, they are the person. And the destruction of maleness brings about sooner or later the destruction of femaleness. And what follows is the erasure of sexuality. Andrew Sullivan, journalist in the US, has written extensively about this, and he has articulated very clearly, if there is no male or female, there is no sexuality either. And if there is no concrete sexuality, that is concrete by meaning determined by the objective reality of the body, then we are left just with gender, that is with sexual identity as a personal choice over a given biological basis. I don't know how much of this you have followed, but the term gender is traced back to a psychologist called John Williams Money. He was at Johns Hopkins and one of the first to study the psychology of sexual fluidity, as he called it, and the social constructs of gender that affect the individual. Recent academic work have criticized Money's work in many respects, especially in regards to his involvement with the sex reassignment of David Reimer and his eventual suicide. And Money's work was disseminated by another guy called Stoller, who was a psychiatrist at UCLA and his gender identity clinic. And he's the one that actually provided the whole more quasi-philosophical construct, stating that gender can become independent from sex, suggesting that it is possible to overcome the limits of one's concrete sexual reality by being able to choose freely a sexual identity. Does it sound familiar? So, of course, with such a premise, sexuality is no longer something that configures personal identity, and it becomes a trait that can be determined by each person according to tastes and qualities. So I claim that that is all made up construct, made up in their minds and maybe in their wishes, but that has not bearing on reality. Okay, so why is all this important? I said already that sexuality affects in a more general way the aptitude of forming bonds of communions with others. That relationship. Men and women equal in dignity, sharing equally in humanness, but two different expressions of human nature. And this is interesting when you consider the Genesis narrative presenting man and woman as persons with a relationship of reciprocity. So Adam is male, but is not a man, is a man, but is not male until Eve appears, and vice versa. And Pope Francis also writes about this and explains. Here's his quote. He says, well, actually, that's another quote. Also, valuing one's body in its femininity or masculinity is necessary if I'm going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different. In this way, we can joyfully accept the special gifts of another man or woman, the work of God the Creator, and find mutual enrichment. It is not a healthy attitude which would seek to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. And I'll come to this in a minute. So the anthropological dissection of the reality of sexual dimorphism can be verified at the biological level. And as I started earlier, bringing up the study on fMRI, many scientists and others are mapping out what can be called the neurobiology of connection and relationship. And I'll move on to some examples. I don't know if you stop to consider that the best and more succinct description of human as a social being is contained in a very simple line in Genesis where the Creator says, "It is not good for the man to be alone." So this passage of Genesis then drives on the narrative on the appearance of the couple as the origin of society, not the other way around. And the passage is important because it does not describe a happenstance event or simply two acquaintances get together, but rather it describes a special connection between a man and a woman that drives the future of society. It's almost like the cliff notes, in a sense, to the very difficult and painstaking effort to understand the whole bodily and spiritual machinery that allows the forming of a special bond between the couple, and therefore the successful building of society. So what makes this connection between two persons so special? First, the study of the brain shows that humans are hardwired for close attachments to other people, beginning with our mother, father, other extended family, and then the broader community. And when I use the term hardwire, it's more of a metaphor than a technical term to indicate, but it does indicate something that is biologically primed and can be discerned in the structure of the human brain. The second point is that a significant body of evidence also shows that we are hardwired for meaning, that we are born with a built-in capacity and drive to search for purpose. And I will also show a few examples of how this works. And then the third point is that differences in human behavior show what I call an adaptive complementarity between males and females, with males having, on average, better motor and spatial activity abilities, and females superior memory and social cognition. And all that has a purpose. So this is one example. The case of the hormone oxytocin. This slide is just for nerds. But oxytocin is a hormone that mediates social behaviors, and many animal studies have clarified that role, as well as another parallel hormone called vasopressin, and they are essential in male-female bonding. These hormones circulate in the blood, and they exert their actions on brain cells, specific brain cells that contain the receptors for the hormone. And those receptors are differentially activated, by that I mean functional, on very diverse areas of the brain. In general, there are areas that are involved in the generation of a pleasurable response, and that's what we call the reward circuitry, that is also activated with other means, exercise, drugs of abuse, you name it. So many other studies also have shown that oxytocin is released into the bloodstream of females during intercourse, that they affect the limbic areas of the brain in ways that promote emotional intimacy and bonding. There's a lot of work on that, and it is also released during birth and lactation, and appears to strengthen the bonding between the attachment of the mother to the baby. That has been shown in many other species too. In several other species, attachment bonds trigger parental care, and this behavior in turn further increases hormonal level. So this is very important. So, one can argue what's the driving here? Is it the behavior that drives the biology, or is the biology that drives the behavior? Well, in this particular instance, it is the behavior that drives the biology. So when there are different species, and the experiments have been done in animals, where when the pups are born, the male takes also a nurturing role, and they can measure the levels of these hormones before the pups are in the cage, and they can measure them after, and there is an increase in the level of the hormones, which suggests that the hormones are increasing also to maintain that care of the offspring that is essential in that particular case. So that is very interesting, that a behavior is the one that is going to be driving the hormonal levels, and it creates like a circuit and facilitate caretaking. So similar studies have been done also in humans, and I'll come to that in a minute. The most typical bonding experiment or model that is used is the mother-offspring. Is the most evident and obvious in a sense. But just to stress this point, it so happens that men also experience substantial changes with parenthood. For example, we all know that in males, testosterone is associated both with sexual desire and with aggression. Well, there is work by Gray and colleagues that have shown that testosterone levels in new fathers were lower than men of the same age who didn't have children. And that suggested that for men, becoming sexually and intimately bonded with a spouse in marriage lowers testosterone levels, reducing the biological basis for violent behavior and also for sexual promiscuity. So somebody could answer, well, what comes first? Well, there's been a follow-up study confirming that committed parenting precedes the change in testosterone. So like with the example I gave you earlier about the animals. So researchers found that men that had the highest level of testosterone were more likely to become committed parents and fathers, and at that point their testosterone levels started to go down, and they were lower, those levels, than similar married men without children. So the study also went further and revealed that men that spend a lot of time with their children have even lower levels of testosterone, so they even drops further. And that appears to be the biological adjustment that helps men shift their priorities to care for their children. So these results are also very congruent with studies describing that men with high testosterone levels that maintain those high testosterone levels are more likely to have marital problems or to get divorced. There is also another set of studies coming from Janice Kegel at Ohio State that documented the connection between very close sexual relationships, especially between married couples, and the physiological processes such as immune, endocrine, cardiovascular functioning. And their work suggests that relationship intimacy is linked to better health. In other words, people that have intimate relationship were able to have better immune systems, and they could measure that in the rate, bless you, the rate at which wounds would close, with having much shorter times for that. And especially that was present in women. And they studied this at different levels. So they did the study with newlyweds, and they found those results, and then they wanted to verify that the results were not just a chance of a less mature connection. And then they studied older couples that had been married for decades, and they found exactly the same results. Other studies have also provided mechanistic insights into spouses' shared risk. For example, gene expression, which may sound so biologically powerful and not amenable to manipulation from the outside, but it does. Gene expression is shaped both by genetic and environmental regulators. And in husbands and wives, it exhibits a huge transcriptional similarity. So it's like, you have a set of men and women that have their own system in how the levels of gene expression function, and after they are married, those levels, that cyclicity becomes attuned and much more evens off, which is a fascinating reality. The other thing is also that these changes are long-term. This investigator, Janice Kelter, in her studies comments that just looking at those outcomes of her studies, she says it gives new layers to the meaning till death does us part, because it really is a very long-term kind of adjustment. Not only that, but looking at those results from these studies, in many instances not driven necessarily by any attempt at justifying anything, it shows that relationships of intimacy that develop in a premise of permanence, such as marriage, are not just a cultural creation, but one way that they are in a way inscribed into our own reality of humans. And it makes sense because that intimate relationship is the appropriate context for human flourishing, not only for the spouses, but also for the offspring. And there are also very profound neurobiological correlates. For example, well, we all know that baby humans cannot survive on their own. Most animals, not all, but most animals can. And there are evolutionary reasons for this, but ultimately the fact is that an infant needs a particular environment to survive and to thrive. So a roof, warmth, food, and cleaning may be basic needs that can be provided perhaps by anyone. But we know it is not enough. And there is also a lot of data that shows that hugs and the physical tactile contact with the parent is quite essential. For example, using monkeys for this work, if baby monkeys are separated from their mothers, those monkeys will develop a strong and lasting attachment to inanimate surrogates. They put like dolls, very soft dolls in the cage with the baby monkeys. And the infants are more attached to the doll even than to the milk that is being produced artificially. So they show a preference to hug the doll than to kind of attach to the bottle of milk. By contrast, when they do the studies in the mothers, postpartum female monkeys also, when the baby is taken away and a surrogate doll is being presented instead, the monkeys develop an attachment to that doll. So, and actually they did the study to verify what about the doll was essential, and the tactile dimension, being soft, was one of the most essential points to that. There are other data from the clinical world showing that soft touch can be calming and therapeutic and even psychologically necessary, not just for infants, but for everyone, and that attachment bonds, even those that appear to be very complex or unique or sophisticated, many times can be triggered by those sensory cues. So human contact cannot be substituted by inanimate objects. I didn't mean to say that, but rather these experiments show that the human person needs both spiritual and also physical love. And we have other evidence from studies of institutionalized children that show how a profoundly degraded social environment can result in long-lasting biological and psychological dysfunction. So, again, meeting their physical needs as humans is not enough, but rather is the environment, an environment of caring, nurturing, and love that is needed. Furthermore, parental presence has an impact on the biological development of children. For example, there is a lot of work done, this time in experimental animals, in rats, showing that the amount of licking of the mother to the pup determines the viability and the future health of those rats. And that has been done doing cross-fostering experiments where they take the pups away from the mother and put them with another surrogate female, and then analyze the behavior of the little rats as they develop. So that has been extensively described and at many levels. And what has been shown is that maternal care, in the case of the rats licking the pups, is the driver of a specific gene expression that is essential for thriving. Does this happen in humans too? Well, there is a group that has studied this question, and what they did is they compare suicidal subjects that had a history of child abuse with suicidal subjects that did not have a history of child abuse. And when they studied the several markers, in this particular case glucocorticoids in the hippocampus, they showed that both groups had a substantial difference, and the ones that had been abused, their levels were completely altered, and that change was correlated with suicidal behavior. So again, rats and humans, a similar mechanism where that maternal, paternal, that environment provides a context where healthy development happens, and if that's missing, there is a substantial impact to the individual. Another example which is very interesting, the brain's reward circuitry. So there are many cases that show how the presence of the parents affect the biological development of the children, not only in childhood, but also late extended into adolescence. For example, there was an 8-year prospective study of girls and within their families. And one of the findings was that girls that were living with their biological father had puberty later, and girls that were living with a non-biologically related male, the mother's boyfriend, stepfather, whatever, developed puberty much earlier. So that's a kind of an interesting finding also. The reason this can happen is because of the pheromones, that chemical substances secreted by the body that when inhaled they can drive behavioral responses. So it's a very complex interaction, but that's another one. The other thing is studies that have shown how the permanence in relationships, such as the marriage bond, represent an acknowledgement that humans thrive and have a better chance at developing when they are in the proper context. There is another psychologist, Judith Wallerstein, that has decades-long work. She was a pediatric psychologist and had a lot of patients that were children of divorce. And when she studied the outcomes, what she found out is that children from high conflict families whose parents stayed together did better in life at large. This was a prospective study over 25 years, than children from high conflict families whose parents divorced. So what she concluded from those studies is that, among other things, that children are more resilient to family conflict than we think, and more vulnerable to parental separation. Okay, I started this talk by citing the fMRI studies to investigate human social attachments, and said that they provide evidence, those fMRI studies, of interconnected neural systems that integrate to establish, maintain, and enhance affiliative bonds. There is another investigator, Ruth Feldman, from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, that has been working all her life in this topic too. And this is a figure from one of her papers that summarizes the neurobiological basis of human attachment. She studies it in the context of development and evolution. But like those other studies with fMRI, she also highlights that human bonds promote homeostasis, health, well-being throughout life, and social attachments that enhance health and happiness, while social isolation increases stress, impairs health, and death. In this figure, Dr. Feldman provides a schematic representation of the 4 bonds that she uses and their expression. The darker blue is more intense, and as you go to the right of the screen, it becomes lighter, meaning there is a less of an intensity of that connection. So the most intense is the parental or maternal connection, then the romantic pair, friendships, and other fellow humans or conspecifics. There is an evolutionary origins here that she describes. I'm not going to get into at all, but in her studies, she has shown that this evolution in the intensity of the connections is connected with the levels of the oxytocin molecule I mentioned earlier, and also of another molecule, which is dopamine, which is considered the happy hormone, right? And their action in very specific areas of the brain. Okay, so let me conclude here by just going back to the basics. These are just some examples from the neurobiology. There are many more, but they point out to the fact that our human makeup requires the recognition and acceptance of our sex identity as males or females, and a commitment to each other at the basic biological level. And that grounding our identity in this sex reality underscores human relationality, constitutes a very powerful antidote, I claim, to the pervasive Gnostic mindset. Understanding brain processes can contribute to counter the pretense that nothing is real, that there is no order nor nature, and the presumption that each individual is absolute in self, with no one to place limitations and free to break all ethical norms. And let me end with a quote by Ruth Feldman. She writes, quote, "To study the neurobiology of human attachment, one must season the objectivity of science with the wisdom of the clinician, foresight of the philosopher, and creativity of the artist into a unified endeavor that can shed new light on the loftiest and oldest of human experiences, love." Thank you very much.
All of this normativity built into biology, but also to the evaluations of what's natural or what's healthy, and then what constitutes flourishing. And sometimes you hear that, what demarcates what's a natural variation according to evolutionary theory, but I tend to think that all of our traits, to some extent, have a physiological basis, and the kind of the choice of what's a natural or a healthy variation. It involves all of these normative judgments about what's flourishing and what's not, and of course it can become politicized as well. So I guess my question here is, how do you demarcate the healthy from the unhealthy in biology and neuroscience? How does this get a big question maybe, but
you can't. I think it all depends. It's a very fluid differentiation, because in the end, what matters is not what you have, but whether you can achieve your fullest potential as an individual, and that can happen under many different situations. One of the best ways to study that is the example of people with a disability. I have a colleague that this is what she studies, and she always tells the story of how when she has a brother that is deaf, and the whole family learned sign language. So her brother, when she's at home, is not disabled, because they all relate. He's only disabled when he's in the outside world surrounded by people that can do sign language. So that provides a very interesting point of reference to understand what can be considered healthy versus non-healthy, because it's not really a straight separation, it's more a matter of grading. And in some instances, what can be unhealthy for an individual may not necessarily be for another one, depending a little bit. And that actually is called being human, because we have that large, wide spectrum of possibilities that allow everybody to fit in there. I don't know if I answer.
No, I think that's great, and you're showing how. Certainly it's not fully deterministic of your behavior and even thing, but at least demarcating, like in your example, we're sexually dimorphic, and then the divergences from that they're deemed unhealthy. They're deemed pathologies, right? It's essential to a certain extent to like the categorization. So I know it's certainly difficult, especially when you go from genotype to phenotype and all of the layering and the complexities of nature nurture. But is there anything more you could say about that, or?
So for the male-female difference, I think the key issue, and this is an evolutionary reality, is the relative size of the gametes. Is what really all boils down, even more than the chromosomes. So big gametes, eggs, identify females, small gametes, the sperm identify males, and that is a continuum throughout evolution. That drives the development of the whole body and a lot of the physiology. But then within the manifestations of that behavior, there is a large, wide range. So that aspect of biology is set, but how that it gets manifested in individuals may change.
Okay, so you talked about the ways in which our biology, almost not deterministically, but creates a pathway kind of for us to follow, and that to a certain extent determines what will constitute flourishing for us. And you also pointed to the ways in which that's led to unhealthy norms in the past as well, and we're kind of always negotiating that, like what's the best way of expressing masculinity and femininity in socially, culturally, and also in relationships. So what would you say are some good ways of leaning into this, sexual dimorphism and complementarity that leads to greater happiness and health for people at the individual relationship level or at the social level?
that's very difficult to answer, Peter.
I'm asking easy questions.
Somebody could say, well, what is to be happy? What does that mean? Yeah. I mean, I'll say obviously, I don't know if it's obvious, but it seems to me it's obvious. When an individual operates within the realm of their identity, they are going to be much more fulfilled. And that fulfillment is one of the manifestations, is manifested in a sense of happiness and of belonging in the world. So if I put all my emphasis in trying to fly like a bird, I'm not going to go very far, probably kill myself, throwing myself from a roof. And it's a stupid example, but the same can happen when one denies, not just ignores, but denies the reality that one has. So is that acceptance of one's reality and identity that makes the main point towards happiness?
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point and a good segue to, we alluded to at the outset, and you did at several points, this kind of philosophy, culturally emphasis on autonomy and choice on the one hand, that, you know, maximally choosing or kind of fitting into my unique mold and expressing that, feeling that that's what happiness comes from. And then there's also, you know, it's a bit of a big word, and maybe many people wouldn't use it to describe what's going on, but I think it describes what you see in some of the medical interventions in this space, this idea of transhumanism, that, you know, we can modify ourselves really to you know, better fit, I guess, our psychological reality or create our own identity. And I think there's a good example you say there that, you know, our biology, it's not deterministic, but you know, for certain things, like, yeah, I can't become a bird, but, you know, maybe someone will try, you know, modifying their body. This sounds kind of absurd, but so I guess my question here on this topic is, you know, you see people, I think, increasingly trying to go up against these limits and have, like, the will override the biology. So, you know, perhaps you can't give a general answer, but maybe you can point to some examples where, like, you come up against these limits very clearly, and you know, the biological reality can't be overridden.
So some of that maybe it can be a misguided, in my opinion, a misguided pursuit of boundaries, of pushing boundaries further. I mean, some people attach to that also very nefast intentions, but other times they probably follow from the lack of recognition of reality, and then a whole crisis of mental health happens that follows that, precisely that lack of recognition of what one is. At least in the, I don't know here, but in the US, in this whole conversation about transgenderism and whatnot, there's a well-known comedian that says, "I'm glad my parents didn't listen to me when I claimed as a child that I was a pirate, because I wouldn't have a hand today." I mean, it's a joke, but it really showcases that there are some things that, yeah, you can push the boundaries, but there is always a limit, because after all, we are not God. And we really thrive when we are in the context for which we belong. It's like trying to get a fish out of water, well, it's going to die. That's not the environment. So trying to get us humans out of the environment that belongs to us will not get us very far either.
Okay, so shifting a bit now to connection and how our biology really fosters that, but staying kind of on this theme of, we see a lot of emphasis on autonomy and choice and boundary and transgression. How does this concept of relationality and its biological basis challenge the notion that individuals are self-sufficient and autonomous beings?
So I teach bioethics frequently, and one time I always start the class trying to challenge what we are going to study a little bit. So I showed the students a short talk on video of this professor in another university talking about what bioethics is all about. And then I asked the class, okay, so, what do you think we are going to talk about? And then pretty much they were all, as I had induced, they were all confused and puzzled, and one of them verbalized it saying, well, it seems like there is no point of reference and all is the same. It's just a matter of where you stand in different issues and how you can solve them. So then the next challenge was, well, is that true? Is it true that we don't have anything? Do we have anything in common? And it was really interesting because the students were able to kind of drive themselves to the conclusion that what kept us, the commonality that we had was our humanity. And they were really willing to explore what that would mean even further. When people are challenged to look a little bit more closely at what their lives mean, there are a lot of people that don't have an anchor anywhere, but the majority can relate to people in their lives that have been a point of light to them. So they know that there is a relationship there, that there is something that drives them. This is maybe unrelated, but I'll share it anyhow. The mother of a friend of mine, she already died, but she was a profound Catholic and very apostolic, and would talk to the stones. So she went one time to the grocery store and was online for buy something, and then gets her turn, looks at the girl that was standing the counter, and says, "How are you, honey? You don't look very happy. I will be praying for you." And then places her order. Goes home, doesn't think anything about it, because that's the way she operates. And then the next day, she's crossing up the parking lot in the same shopping mall, and this woman comes running to her and says, "Remember me?" She didn't know. She says, "I am the one at the counter the other day, and what you told me changed my life." So here's this woman saying, "What did I do?" And she said, "I had decided to commit suicide, and your kind words made me reconsider." It's very powerful. And many, many people, I think that we just need to kind of encourage a verbalization, a sharing of those events that have changed our lives, because that can be, for many cases, the anchor that drives that idea. Yes, there is a connection here. Even something as totally detached as interacting with, the woman taking care of the fish counter in this case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to come back to other examples of, I guess describing or laying greater cultural emphasis on how connectedness and these relationships really positive impact. But I want to ask you first about medicine and the sciences and how they are being affected by this emphasis on autonomy, individualism, and boundary transgression. I even find it a little bit in my own instances of going to the doctor. It's kind of like a change in the ideal of health and human flourishing, away from like the doctor-patient relationship to one where it's almost like sometimes you're a consumer, and they will because health is now being more and more viewed through the lens of the choice and consent, which are which are partly good, but also the kind of subjective expression of the patient and almost like their short-term psychological well-being, and I think you see that with some of the interventions that are going on and being deemed, healthcare. Like for example, assisted suicide here in Canada. It really prioritizes the choice and the short-term avoidance of suffering to the point of death, and with medical interventions in gender. And so, do you see, like, to what extent do you see these values changing the way in which science is done and medicine in particular?
That's a huge topic. In fact, it's gigantic.
Just some examples.
So there is an emphasis on autonomy, and part of that is good, another part is not. The part that is not good is the part that emphasizes autonomy as a counter to the so-called patriarchal dimensions of medicine from the past. So it's a very fine line, because if you go to seek the expertise of somebody who knows how to cure, you really want that person to tell you what he or she knows. You don't want them to say, well, do whatever you want, because then what's the point? I don't need to come to the doctor's office to be told that. However, it's very important that people are engaged in their own care, and therefore that they have the instruments, the cognitive tools to make decisions for their own life to the maximum extent as possible. The problem that I see is actually a philosophical problem. Is the problem of understanding what freedom means. People tend to think that autonomy means do whatever you want. That's not what autonomy means. But when you put it in a very materialistic terms, and that is pretty much the principlism in the US for the bioethical domain, it ends up becoming do whatever you want, disregarding any other considerations but your own wishes. And of course that brings about a nihilistic approach to life. The other thing with this is that and this is another dimension, talking about the euthanasia and assisted suicide, the level of hidden pressure that is involved in that. And I do read that's happening here a lot, probably in the US too. But some of the cases here have been much more publicized in the bioethical world. So, you can be presenting somebody with options, but depending on the tone, the type of words you use, the context, you can be putting undue pressure on that individual. So it is not all about being able to choose freely. It's about how you're being influenced by those choices too. So that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think people only take into account freedom as freedom from coercion, freedom from any determinants, but they forget the other part of freedom, which is the real freedom, which is the freedom within of the self-direction to whatever goal one wants to pursue. And that's why I say it's more philosophical than not.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And final question from me here, but just on that point, the sad thing about this, of course, you've given us great examples of how, dependence, commitment, all these various forms of relationships which require trust and, freely letting go a little bit of your freedom, but I think, culturally we just so emphasize not being dependent, not have any restrictions on your choice, and it's the sad thing is it's preventing us from loving. So
let me say something about that. So it looks like this trend continues. At least in the US, Latinos live 5 years longer than Anglos. So people make fun the demographers that study this and say it must be the nopalitos. But the reality is that the difference is the family ties. That is the main difference in longevity. And it is very substantial. And it's very interesting because in general, I mean the average, there is more diabetes, more chronic disease among people of Latino descent than Anglos theoretically, and yet their lifespan is longer.
Wow, fascinating. So, yeah, final question, kind of along that theme. We didn't talk so much, but I know you alluded to it with some of your quotes from popes. Personalistic philosophy, Catholic philosophy in general, it emphasizes the intertwining of the body, psyche, and spirit. So how can we further promote this holistic view of the person's well-being in our culture today, increasingly focused on separating those dimensions?
Show how much fun you're having.
Yeah, well, there you go.
I mean, it just, I don't know how else to do it, really, because you're not going to be throwing books at people's heads and hope that they stick, right? So I think it has to go just by view of example. I had a student during the pandemic. This woman is an EMT, and of course she was first responder, whatever, and she was assigned to work an ambulance in the Skid Row area of Los Angeles, which is the area of a lot of the homeless. So one of the things that she found out, and in studying this, she was studying what is the best way to take care of the homeless people. Well, one of the answers was just look at them at the face and just develop a connection, because they felt that they were transparent, that people would look through. Of course, many times it's out of fear, but that connection is what they were craving. And that's pretty powerful, but I think it goes beyond just the homeless, obviously, to others.
Yeah, the joy of the gospel, like the quote. Yeah, you've got to live it and affirm it. So, thank you. Let's give a big hand for Sonsoles and then audience.
Thank you.
Okay, so audience questions. I'm sure there are lots. Okay, right here.
There's so many things that come to my mind from this lecture, so I'm not sure what to lead with, but maybe what I'll lead with is your thoughts on the role of smartphones, social media, and technology, on the breakdown of our whole attachment ecology. Like there's I see real trouble there. People are not forming bonds. Just talking about family formation, they're just not. They seem to be less capable. Maybe I'm catastrophizing, but there's a reduction in the actual ability to form these bonds. I'm just, and whether the tech has something to do with that, I'm just wondering what your thoughts on this are. People like Jonathan Haidt talk a lot about smartphones and that kind of thing.
I'm just going to repeat briefly for the camera to pick it up. So, social media, smartphones, technology inhibiting our ability to form bonds and attachments.
You've named one of the experts, so I will refer to Haidt and his work. But more and more voices. There is a recent, and I don't know the specifics, I didn't read it, but there's been some recent result coming out from school districts that have been forbidding phones at school, and they have been improving their scores, things like that. I think that probably the judge is still out, in a sense. It looks like a huge problem, but how to control it other than controlling the use of those phones, it's hard to tell how to do it, but it's definitely a problem. I mean, there's nothing more sad than being at a restaurant and there's a couple sitting at the table next and they are each on their phone. They're not talking. So there is also a movement against that, where people go for dinner and they put all their phones in a basket and things like that. I'm hearing more and more of that attitude going around. But the fact that we have to drive those kind of premeditated decisions means that we are attached to the phones. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are too convenient. Yeah.
Over here? Yeah, I can do this actually. I can
go around.
Thank you for a great lecture. You were pointing out in various instances, or at least that's the way I understood it, biological foundations or biological manifestations which actually agree with various points that the church teaches about, for example, taking care of our dear loved ones, etc. So, in that respect, is there any kind of, what is known biologically speaking, in terms of other cases where the church teaches certain things that is currently quite under attack in nowadays world? For example, homosexual tendencies, homosexual behavior, divorce. Is there any similar biological studies? I mean, of course, if you look mainstream, it will be completely polluted, but you are whatever will be.
Yeah, the studies are out there. I think that the work needs to be done to bring them together in a rigorous way. Not so much to showcase the Catholic Church's point, but to showcase humanity. So, because it obviously applies to everyone. I mean, Catholic Church does reaffirm the value of human life, but of human reality. But that's where it can and it should start. In fact, one of the things I highly recommend for everyone is to devote some time to study anthropology. And actually, not a bad place to start is the work of Hannah Arendt, who was Jewish, actually. But her anthropology is very solid and is a non-confessional, in a sense, way to study the human being. But that should be part of anybody's consciousness to do that kind of work. But many studies out there that show different aspects that have been presented also by church teachings as beneficial to society in terms of the care of children, the value of single-sex of marriage between a man and a woman, the involvement of parents in education. There are many issues that have to do also with the social doctrine of the church, economics, the protection of the family. I mean, tons of when science is done right, it cannot contradict.
Right.
So, but
it is asking what science is there.
Yeah. So there are a lot. There is others that is clearly being manipulated to make points, but there is such a thing as karma too, and they get shown, they get pointed out eventually. We just need to be very honest in how we present what's available, and also showing when there is doubts and why.
Thanks for the talk. So from an evolutionary perspective, and perhaps even a neurobiological one, isn't the same factors that drive love and human connectedness the same factors that drive people to bias their families and perhaps ultimately do something that's illegal for them? Can't this promote racism? For example, I'm a depression researcher with a gene editing background and have given a number of talks on these topics. And thus, wouldn't this deep love and preference for our families ultimately drive people to enhance or prefer their children so that they could have an advantage over other families, which indirectly, as this is my research, prevent their own depression and suicide? Again, ultimately, doesn't this drive racism? and human genetic enhancement, and/or human genetic enhancement? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, and indeed, we can always use scientific advancements for good or evil. So a lot of those techniques can have a huge impact. I mean, I can envision using them to fix a default gene, for example, and things like that, that could be just, let's say, prevent sickle cell anemia or things like that. But of course, the same techniques that allows us to do that allows us also to do selective cloning, to do other modifications that are not warranted. And that is the risk of human freedom. There is no way around it other than having a strong commitment to pursuing the truth. And pursuing the truth means pursuing what is coherent with the human reality and identity. But we are going to encounter that all the time. And there is really no solution, because that's exactly what being human means, is having the option to pursue things to the ultimate point, knowing very well that it can also be used for purposes that are not conducive to the best of humanity.
It's got time for one or two more questions. And June, can you come up here? Don't go so far. There you go.
Thank you very much for the talk. There's one question. You mentioned that our masculinity and femininity have biological basis, but also sort of impacted by our environment and society. And many times you also mentioned this, that those can be faulty, like the way society maybe express these things. How do we ourselves, and how do we help maybe our children and friends to distinguish, or like to see what is the true masculinity and femininity? That's my question. Thank you.
Another easy question.
No, that's a huge one too. Okay, I'll answer with a story. I was having lunch with my family in an outdoor place in Spain. Spain is very machista, or used to be. So it was like a mall, and there were some, how do you call it? It's like those animals that you put some coins and they move, and the kids love it, whatever you call those. So this family walks by, and one of the kids beelines to this, it was like a elephant or something, and says, can I ride this, can I read this? And the father says, that's for girls because it's pink. I was about to stand up and say, excuse me, sir, but I didn't do anything. But this is the problem. So we kind of, we have to stop and think, like, what the heck did I just say? Because pink is not for girls. Who cares? I mean, in fact, pink is the Marines color. They call it rosé, but it's the same. So, I mean, colors don't have sex. That's ridiculous. But there is a tradition, that's where there is a tradition that is not worth maintaining. It's not something that, it's not a hill to die on at all. So it's worth, I mean, it does require conscious thinking through those things and being able to identify within society and within our family traditions and our family culture, which is very dependent on sometimes geography and other things, what aspects here of these are worth maintaining and which ones are worth letting go, and the sooner the better kind of thing. But other than that, I went to a conference on, well, the title was interesting, but it was on pretty much the consequences of sexual dimorphism. And it was put together by a foundation in Santa Fe that works with men, with boys. And one of the things that was that came across very strongly was the data showing that rough play is essential to drive male behavior. So the speaker was talking about all this work showing that getting on the floor with the boys was essential, and he told the story of how when he was discussing this with his wife, she said, well, but I don't know how to do that, you know, I cannot throw myself on the floor in a sense. And he said, well, try and we'll see what happens. What happened was that the boys, this family they had 3 boys, the boys were playing with the mother the same way, but they were gentler. So what they learned is they learned that difference, that they can kind of pummel the father, but they have to be gentler with the mother. And that's what they learn from things like that. So it's very interesting how play behavior is essential, but there is that thinking through of what it takes in a sense. I don't know if this helps.
Yeah, deliberation, prudence. One more question. Yes.
To go back to your discussion of people who are transitioning, did you imply that there is a connection with mental illness there?
Yes, I did imply that.
Okay.
Is that your question? Yeah.
Yes, I did imply that. And the reason is that those transitionings at large, there may be exceptions, though it's hard to kind of pinpoint, but at large imply a rejection of one's reality. And a rejection of one's reality is the definition of mental illness. So from that point of view, yes, it does imply something. And in fact, data shows that the majority of people transitioning are in the autism spectrum. In the autism spectrum. Can there be some exceptions to that? Human biology at large is an open system. There is no black and white. So there can be exceptions. But we have here also the problem perhaps that can be found with the gay world. So what's the difference between an experience and solidifying that into an outcome? Acting upon that feeling, or acting upon that discomfort, or acting upon, especially as adults. So are there people out there that have been transitioned for 34 years and are very happy? I'm sure there are. In fact, I don't know, at least 2. Is that the ideal for a human being? I would argue it's not.
Wow, what an enriching discussion. Covered a lot of difficult subject matter with grace and elegance, and I think gave us a lot of fascinating examples of all of the beautiful ways in which human relationships can contribute to such, the heights of our flourishing. So I just want to give a big thank you to you for coming up here in
Thank you for having me.
the depths of winter, and thank you all for great questions and for coming. Round of applause, please.
Thank you.